Okay, so this is going to be our video lecture for the England's revolutions. I'm going to do, there's 3 PowerPoints in your modules, but I'm going to do all 3 of them at one time. But I do have them broken up for this lecture into how that they are in the module. So the first one is Elizabeth the First and James the First, and this will be in your first in your module. So what this is going to start is going to start the revolutions that are happening in Europe that we're going to talk about. And for the most part, everything that we talk about from here on out will in some way, shape or form, shape Europe for all of the revolutions that will happen, and also World War One. So there are things that are going to happen in France and in Russia and in England, although they kind of get themselves straightened out a little bit. But everything that kind of happens between these countries shapes what happens in World War One, starting in 1914. All right, so here's your vocabulary, and I won't go over that, but you need to know your vocabulary and then your people for this unit. Okay. All right. So Queen Elizabeth she is the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And if you'll remember, Henry VIII is the one that had so many wives. He had 6 wives. And remember, he changed the religion in England so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. He was married to Catherine of Aragon from Spain, and he needed a son, or he thought he needed a son. So he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn so that he could have a son, but instead he and Anne had Elizabeth. Now, remember, his changing the religion in England had nothing to do with religious tactics. It had to do completely and totally with politics. And remember, then Anne Boleyn was the one that was one of the 2 that were beheaded. But Elizabeth will take the throne after her sister Mary dies. And if you'll remember, her sister Mary was Bloody Mary, and she was Catholic. And she will be the one who kills so many Protestants because she hates that her father changed the religion back to Protestant, or changed it to Protestant. And so she will kill thousands of Protestants in retaliation for that. Elizabeth herself is not very religious, but she wants to bring some type of peace back to the country after the turmoil that her sister brought. So during her reign, England will become the leader of the Protestant nations in Europe. She does resist becoming involved in a lot of wars. She does have some things. She does send her armies to various skirmishes in various places, like in the Netherlands, to help out certain countries. But she herself does not really get involved in many wars. But she's still seen as a very strong queen. Now, her brother-in-law, who was married to Mary, Philip II of Spain, he will mount an unsuccessful campaign against her. This is the Spanish Armada, to try to take over the country. He thinks he or his daughter should, by rights, be leader of England, because they want it to be a Catholic nation, and it was a Catholic nation under Mary. And Elizabeth just whips him soundly and sends him whimpering back to Spain, and we don't hear much from him again. If you take a look at this picture of Elizabeth, you'll see various things about her. Number one, this is a wig she's wearing, although she did have red hair. I mean, like bright red hair like her father. But this is a wig she's wearing because the makeup she wore, if you look at her face, she's wearing like a very thick white makeup that was very popular during that time, and it had lead in it. And of course, they didn't know that this was bad for them. And so her face was very, very lumpy because of the lead in it. And it also caused her hair to fall out. This was the time that the sugar was being processed from the colonies in South America. So she got addicted to these little candies called sugared violets. And so her teeth started falling out also. So, attractive there. But She is known as the Virgin Queen because she never marries and she never has children. Now, the one of the things that is she is just like for her father and her sister is she is terrified of who's going to take the throne after she dies. And so she does not want her Stuart cousins to take the throne from Scotland. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, reasons that I really can't get into here. But she doesn't want her Stuart cousins to take the throne to the point where when her sister Mary was still alive, they imprisoned their cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, because they suspected that she was trying to overtake the throne of England. They imprisoned her in the tower of the tower there in London, and eventually had her beheaded. But ironically, Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James, will be the one to take the throne of England when Elizabeth dies. So James Stuart, he is known as James the Sixth of Scotland because he is the sixth James to rule in Scotland, but he'll be the first James to rule in England, will take the throne. Now, he'll take the throne in 1603 when Elizabeth dies. Now, several things about James. He is, first of all, a Catholic, but he's smart enough to kind of like hide it and not really rock that boat. But he is a very, very devout believer in the divine rights of kings. In the divine rights of kings theory, as you remember, states that he believes that he is only placed on the throne by God and can only be taken off the throne by God, and he answers only to God. Now, even though he believes that, he's smart enough to like not mess with Parliament too much. He knows Parliament has control there, and so he really doesn't like struggle with Parliament as much as some of his successors will. And he's smart enough to just kind of like deal with the Protestants in England and understand that they are Protestant, and he just needs to shut his mouth. He is known for bringing the concept of witchcraft into England and like making that spread like wildfire into Europe. He was told when his wife was coming over from Denmark that there was a very bad storm, and that she was cursed, and so by witches. And so he just is very superstitious, and he actually writes a book about witchcraft, and is published. So he's kind of one of the ones that brings this concept of witchcraft into England, and then it's spread through that. But because he wants to be seen by the Protestants as a king that understands them, one of his contributions is that he translates, or he finished translating the Bible into English. It was actually started by William Tinsdale, who got killed for his troubles for that. But he finishes translating the Bible into English, and that will be called the King James Bible. Now, the rule of the Stuarts overall is very controversial, not just under James, but they don't overall work well with Parliament. They all believe in the divine rights of kings theory, and they do inherit some problems from the Tudors, but they also make some problems for themselves. Again, they are Catholic. James is smart enough to hide it. He will leave England as Protestant, but he does try to introduce more Catholic practices in the church. But one of the things that he does leave in his legacy for his sons is that he does not believe that Parliament should ever control his reign as king. Okay? All right, so then we're going to talk about his son and grandsons. Now, his son is a complete idiot, unlike himself. His son doesn't know when to shut up. So his son, Charles I, will take the throne. And his son, again, believes in the divine rights of kings. And his son believes in it to the point where he like struggles with Parliament the whole time. Like Parliament will pass a law and he's like, you have no right to pass that law. I'm the king. And so he spends most of his reign struggling with Parliament for power which is going to end up leading to civil wars in England because Parliament has the right to like form an army. And Charles doesn't think that they do. And so Charles will form armies also. So there'll be a civil war in England regarding this. And the first will be between Charles and Parliament. Parliament will build an army with Oliver Cromwell leading it. This will end with a victory over Charles, and it will end with Charles losing his head. Now, Charles II, who is the son of Charles I, will form an army, but is also defeated by Oliver Cromwell, and he's kind of forced into hiding. So after this, Oliver Cromwell will become a military dictator. And England is a commonwealth at this point, meaning there's no king or queen. So Oliver Cromwell is the first non-royal to rule England since like 1066, since like William the Conqueror. And so he's the military dictator for a while. His son will rule after his death. He's not very competent. And so Parliament's kind of stuck with what do they do? Like, do they have a president? Do they just have a prime minister? Like, where do they go? And so they decide to bring the monarchy back. And so they kind of like, well, where do we go for this monarchy? The only place to really go is back to the Stuarts, which is not their best idea ever. But they will go back to the Stuarts, and they will then select Charles II as the king. Okay, so Charles II, he's the son of Charles I and grandson of James I, will be selected as king. Now, Charles II is kind of seen as a breath of fresh air. He's nothing like his father. He's a lot like his grandfather at first. He's seen as working well with Parliament. Under Cromwell, Cromwell was very, very strict. So he had closed the Church of England. He had closed the theaters. Like, it was kind of like quarantine this summer. You couldn't do nothing and you couldn't have any fun. And so under Charles II, people were dressing in bright clothes again, and the theaters were open, and people were able to go and listen to music and see plays. And so even though he was a divine right ruler, meaning again that he believed in the divine rights of kings, at first he kind of like hid his aspirations. He hid what he felt like he wanted to do, and he just was like, hey, I'm going to be a great leader, and I'm going to work with Parliament, and here's your theaters, and here's your music, and here's everything that you wanted. And so people were lulled into this feeling of, oh, he's going to be a really good king. Now, here's the problem that's going to start coming in. He's going to start having a lot of problems with Parliament again because he wants to be a divine right of rule. The second thing that's going to be a problem is he has no legitimate children. So if you remember, if you look back in our vocabulary, and if you remember when we've talked before, a king or queen could only have a child to rule under them if they were legitimate, if they were married to their mother or father at the time of their at the time of their birth. Charles had like 11 illegitimate children with various mistresses, but none with his wife that had been able to live to adulthood. So at the time that Charles II is in power, Parliament is concerned because James, his brother, is the only successor that could rule. And James is an open Catholic and has said, when I rule, when I take the throne, I will change the religion back to Catholicism. The Church of England will be no more. We will be back with the Roman Catholic Church. And Parliament is tired of changing religions. I mean, we've been back and forth, back and forth, back and forth since the 1500s. Well, even though Parliament's worried about that, they are also kind of like, okay, well, it shouldn't be too bad because his only two children that he has, and this is James, are two daughters, and their mother is Protestant, and they are promised to men who are Protestant to marry. So maybe, James is not young, so maybe we can get out of this, without too many problems. But they did try to pass a bill called an exclusion bill that said if a king or queen is an open or practicing Catholic or is married to one, they can't rule. Well, this is where Charles and his greediness and his unwillingness to work with Parliament comes flying out of the closet. Charles shows them that he is not willing to work with Parliament at all, and he dissolves Parliament before the bill can be passed. And Parliament's like, well, you can't do that. And Charles is like, well, I did. So you need to go home. So the bill is never passed while Charles is alive. Okay. So the bill is not passed, the exclusion bill, which means that James can rule if Charles II dies. So Charles II dies in 1685, and his brother, James, comes to rule. Now, James, at the time that he comes to rule, only has 2 daughters, and they are both Protestant. Now, he is an open and practicing Catholic. The exclusion bill was not passed, and so Parliament is very concerned. He starts appointing Catholics to high offices in the government, and this does lead to a conflict with Parliament. So the only saving grace is that he only has daughters, and it's like, okay, well, he can't live very long, surely, and then his daughters will come to rule, and then we'll be okay. Maybe we can get out of this without too much damage. Well, then he's married again, and he has a son. And if you understand the laws that we've talked about, that son will take the throne over his sisters, even though he's younger. Now, even if he is a day old, 2 days old, 4 days old, a week, it doesn't matter how old he is. If his father dies, his mother would be like his advisor and take the role of monarch in his stead, and she's Catholic. So Parliament still has a problem regardless of what happens. And this is their fear, is that this will create a Catholic succession of leadership for England. They do not want a Catholic monarchy, and they are tired of religions changing over the years. So a group of Protestant nobles decides to go to James's oldest daughter, Mary, who is married to the leader of the Netherlands called William of Orange. And they are both Protestant, and they ask them to invade England. Now, I put invade in quotation marks because they tell them, we have no plans on fighting you. Now, James may get together an army, but it won't be a very strong army because nobody really likes him. And he might pull some Irish Catholics over from Ireland, but, it won't be, by the time you get over here, he will not have time to pull together a pretty big army. So we would like for you to invade England. So William does invade England, and they do have a few small battles. It is like very few people are killed. Very few people are killed. James understands what's happening. He doesn't oppose him. He throws his seal into the river, which is basically abdicating the throne, meaning he's giving it up, and then he leaves for France. Parliament will welcome William and Mary as co-queens, king and queen. They have equal power. And then they announce that James has abdicated the throne. For the first time in the history of Europe, the monarch, William, and his wife Mary, have the religion of their people rather than the people being required to have the religion of the monarch. And that's pretty significant. That obviously, just in that statement, that's never happened before, because we have always said, we talked about the Peace of Augsburg in Germany, where the German princes, you had to have the religion of the German princes. We haven't got to the Peace of Westphalia yet, where you could choose your own religion. That's still a little ways off. So this is very significant in the Reformation, because we're still in the middle of the Reformation. that we finally have a monarch who has the religion of his people, not the other way around. This is called the Glorious Revolution. And it's called the Glorious Revolution for many reasons. There was not really a revolution. Nobody was really killed. Nobody was really injured. And there was a peaceful transition into a new monarchy. But the thing about the Glorious Revolution for most historians is that it disproves the divine rights of kings theory in several ways. It disproves it because we have forced a king to abdicate. Remember, the divine rights of kings theory states that only God has the right to take the king off the throne. Well, Parliament proved that wrong. They forced him to abdicate. And then the divine rights of kings theory also states that only God can put a king on the throne. Well, Parliament did that. They placed William and Mary as king and queen in power. Now, before they allowed Mary and William to be king or queen, they did have to sign a statement saying that they agreed to a new Bill of Rights. So the Parliament creates a new Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights states that it keeps anyone who is a practicing Catholic or who marries a Catholic cannot take the throne. It also suspends the crown's power to create laws, and it creates a constitutional monarchy. And there's the definition there for a constitutional monarchy. It permanently establishes Parliament as the ruling power of England. Now, after William and Mary die, the throne will go to Mary's sister Anne, who has been living in Germany. And now this will begin the German Hanover line and will eventually be the line that is in power during the American Revolution. And then that's kind of where we'll pick up this week is the American Revolution, just briefly, and then we'll get into the section that will start the French Revolution.